Asymmetrical Haircuts Justice Update with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
We have our end of year special for you today, a roundup of our favorite episodes of the year.
And this year, our favourite picks have been hand-selected and gift-wrapped for you by all of the team here at Asymmetrical Haircuts.
Yeah, today you're not only hearing from us, but you also get a chance to hear from our interns and producers who work tirelessly behind the scenes every week to get this podcast out to you.
Yeah, boy, my goodness, we've had a really busy year. We had a huge number of news klaxons with lots of multiple breaking news stories from the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Like fairly recently, we had the issuing of the arrest warrants against Israel's Prime Minister, the former Defense Minister, and the head of Hamas's armed wing. And it's all kept you quite busy, hasn't it, Steph?
Absolutely. It feels like the Gaza conflict has kind of sucked the air out of everything else that I've been doing this year. This was, of course, the big news that they finally issued that arrest warrant that we'd been waiting for 6 months to find out if the judges did it. And it follows, of course, on the International Court of Justice also having breaking news in May this year when they ruled that Israel had to immediately halt its military offensive on Rafah in the Gaza Strip. And this already began at the very start of the year when the world's media, and me included, of course, descended on the ICJ when South Africa brought this genocide case accusing Israel of committing genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. And of course, regretfully, that conflict is still ongoing. And even though there's a lot of other stuff going on now as well, the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, we shouldn't forget what is going on in Gaza still, even if we don't get as many pictures of it as from other situations.
And the debate has been going on all year about the meaning of genocide and the meaning of intent. And I think that's something that we're going to have to pick up in the new year. And beyond Gaza and beyond the Middle East, we've also kept an eye on Ukraine. We had a series of episodes, partly because Ukraine's become quite an interesting space for experimentation and to see how to do accountability in the middle of a conflict. So we also covered conflict-related sexual violence there, the strain on Ukraine's own domestic legal system, and the possibility of whether you can make hate speech accountable, the hate speech that came out from Russia. I also had a chance to actually visit Ukraine this year, which I was very excited to do, even in the midst of quite a difficult situation there. I was actually at a trauma conference and I really started thinking about the long-term effects of conflict on various societies.
And we had a bit of a busman's holiday, an outing to Switzerland, where we were invited to do a podcast on if the Geneva Conventions are still fit for purpose 75 years on. And we had a live podcast event in The Hague to mark the city's 125th anniversary of the City of Peace and Justice.
And just thinking about some of the big names that we've had on, we had Karima Bennoun, who's former UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, talking about gender apartheid.
And we talked to the former head of UNITAD, Christian Richer, in the final days of his mandate. UNITAD is, of course, looking at war crimes and atrocities in Iraq and what ISIS was doing and the crimes against the Yazidi community.
We also managed to get hold of Pramila Patten, who's the United Nations Secretary General's Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict. And that was quite useful just to establish a kind of baseline on what we were saying about Israel and Palestine on sexual and gender-based crimes there.
And in our series on mechanisms and justice mechanism, we talked to the former head of the IIIM, Catherine Marchi-Houel. And the IIIM, of course, is the UN mechanism that collects evidence of war crimes and tries to look at prosecutable cases out of Syria. And in the new year, we're hoping to chat to Robert Petit, who took over from her, to see what the IIIM is going to do now.
And in my own backyard here in Vilnius, managed to sit down with then Lithuania's Vice Minister of Justice, Gabija Grigaitė-Daugirdę, to talk about the prospects for some kind of a special tribunal for Ukraine. And Lithuania's also been in the news over Belarus because they have asked for the ICC to intervene there.
Yeah, looking back at what we did this year, we have kind of too many names to name, so we won't go back all of them, but we want to thank everybody who's given their time and their effort to speak to us and share their analysis and expertise. And we also want to thank our wonderful team here in The Hague for putting together these episodes and putting up with our scheduling and chaos. And most of all, we want to thank you, the listeners. We really enjoy making this podcast, and we're so grateful that it has found an audience and people who actually enjoy listening to us ramble on about our kind of special interests.
Yeah, if you are listening over the Christmas period, you're obviously one of the diehards like us, and we really, really appreciate you and your commitment to our oeuvre. And a little public announcement here, just be sure to keep listening, hit that subscribe button. I think our producer wrote this, didn't she? Thanks, Susanna. And make sure you hear all the great content we have coming in 2025, including, I wrote this bit, a deep dive in January into Australia's alleged war crimes and the investigation that's being going on into what happened with their troops in Afghanistan. And also in January, we have a look at some of the justice challenges facing the United States as President Trump gets inaugurated. And I know we've already pre-recorded, so I can tell people about this. In February, we have a couple of podcasts on coordination, which may sound a bit boring, but I'm really fascinated by things like the Genocide Network at Eurojust and the Atrocity Crimes Group based in Ukraine, and kind of asking the question, what do they do and how useful are they?
So why don't you kick back, relax, and enjoy this episode? Maybe you're eating some Christmas leftover or drinking some bubbly, perhaps. You're treating yourself, and here the producer comes in, to the traditional New Year's dessert of oliebollen, which I am not a big fan of, but if you are in the Netherlands and you do enjoy them, I hope you really enjoy them. I am mostly looking forward to this very Dutch thing that we're going to be doing on Christmas Day, which is going to be gourmetten, which is going to be having to all prepare your own small little dish in a little pan, because my son likes it, and we started it because it was so corny that we thought it was hilarious, and now we actually enjoy it. So I got suckered in by my own cynicism in doing something for a laugh that we now actually really enjoy.
Well, by the time this goes out, I'll be deep in Turkey, being British, and I think that's a very important tradition as well. I'm going to kick off the whole series, which we've just pre-recorded what everybody's contributions are, but I didn't pre-record mine, so I'm going to kick off and say that my choice for the last year is episode 112, which was the road to a new Crimes Against Humanity treaty that we did with Leila Sadat and Priya Pillai. I picked it because I think that this idea of plugging the gaps in the architecture is going to be a big theme. For example, looking at Syria and what's happening, we're all asking the questions because we can see the challenges, how accountability can actually happen. And I can see this prospective Crimes Against Humanity treaty, which since we did the podcast climbed over another hurdle at the United Nations and looks like it's on its way to a big diplomatic conference to be discussed. But anyway, here's Leila Sadat, and then she's followed by the picks from the whole team.
Crimes against humanity it's really the workhorse of international criminal justice because it can attach to massive and systemic human rights abuses that take place in peacetime. You don't have to show this attack on the group, and it can also take place in wartime. And so if you look, and I did a big empirical study at the ICC, about 30% of the situations only are charging crimes against humanity. And that's so different than what we saw in the ad hoc tribunals, where it was all about the war and the crimes against humanity were sort of ancillary to or auxiliary to the war. And to Priya's really important point, if you care about prevention, you really want to get at the criminality during peacetime.
I've picked my favorite episode of this year, which is episode 104, Laws of War with Janina Dill. Janina gives a really clear explanation of what international humanitarian law can and can't do, and also how it interacts with our expectations of what law can do, mainly shaped by how domestic law works and how you can't really apply that to IHL. I recommend that you go back and listen to the full episode, but we're also going to give you a little excerpt, and this is Janina explaining why international humanitarian law is the bare minimum designed for dire situations and not some kind of optional or aspirational standard.
So it's an unfathomably bold project in historical context, right? Because in fact, it's law that tells states in what is always inevitably an emergency, right? That may well put state survival on the line, that they can't just do whatever it takes, that there are limits to what they're allowed to do, even in war, right? IHL's central message really is that even in that moment of dire emergency, not all means are justified. We sometimes hear arguments to the effect that, well, Israel must prevent another October the 7th. Ukraine's survival is threatened. Surely that must limit the applicability of IHL, or it at least shapes how we interpret it. It must be more permissive here. But that is fundamentally logically misunderstanding what IHL is, because it is already designed for the emergency, for the extreme circumstance of war, right? It largely accommodates what states want and need to do in war, right? It's a kind of a pact with the devil. But if it never took off the table some militarily really sensible courses of action, we really wouldn't need the law. If IHL were only applicable in wars that are not emergencies or perceived as emergencies for those who fight them, we really wouldn't need the law in the first place, right? So in some sense, this law is already designed for the most dire circumstances. And the very idea that you have law governing these dire circumstances is really, really bold. But on the other hand, we must also then see that from a moral perspective, IHL is the bare minimum. Because in order to be complied with, to be able to talk to states in that emergency, it actually allows you to do a lot of things that are morally problematic. It puts up merely these really bright line rules. It doesn't actually, hold you to our normal peacetime moral standards. And so if it looks like you're violating IHL, you are in heaps of moral trouble. If you're complying with IHL, you're not necessarily in the moral clear. That would be the bottom line.
I'm Eliza Borbelli, one of the interns of Asymmetrical Haircuts. Earlier this year, I read Same River Twice, Putin's War on Women by Sophie Oksanen. The essay sheds light on how sexual violence is used as a deliberate weapon of war. And one of her sentences stuck with me. She mentions that Russian soldiers who committed sexual violence said that they would rape their victims, Ukrainian women, until they no longer wanted to have sex with a Ukrainian man. Sexual violence doesn't just traumatize its direct victims. It leaves scars on families, it changes population structures, and the stigma silences survivors. So how do we address this? How do we shift the shame from the survivors to the perpetrators? Janet asked the same question from Dr. Alice Jill Edwards, the United Nations Special Reporter on Torture. So today, I recommend you give a listen to episode 113, Sexual Torture with Alice Edwards.
So it really is a question of leadership to be able to absolve any feelings of shame, even though those shames should not fall on those individuals. And what I think the torture framework offers is to put the shame where it belongs, which is on the perpetrators. This is not about the morality of the victims and survivors. It's about the morality of the perpetrators. They have crossed a line into the code of how we behave as human beings and what we understand as dignity and humanity. And that is where the shame should lie. And of course, there's huge amounts of work for us to get there. Accountability is one of those stages, rehabilitation for the whole of society is another, proper legal and procedural frameworks. The report documents quite a number of other steps that can be taken. But the only last thing I wanted to say is involving victims and survivors in any policy or legal decisions affecting them, and not just as people that are consulted, but as co-creators of what that future looks like, of what reparations they're entitled to looks like. That has been a very strong message from all the victims and survivors that I've spoken to. And they were disempowered because of the assaults that occurred to them we do not want to doubly disempower them or subject them to any harms by not considering them partners in the process of recovery and rehabilitation.
My name is Yoko Fink, and I'm an intern at Asymmetrical Haircuts. I'm currently being trained as an audio producer. The episode I chose is number 92, Prosecuting Female Jihadis with Tanya Mera. I chose this episode because it provides powerful insights into how gender influences the prosecution of female jihadis, who have returned to Europe after joining the so-called Caliphate of ISIS. In contrast to the typical binary narratives that portray these women as either innocent victims or evil monsters, Tanya Mera unveils the complexities of their actions and emphasizes the importance of taking these into account when prosecuting them. Ultimately, by highlighting a more critical approach, she encourages us to go beyond typical tropes like the jihadi bride and reveals that women's roles within ISIS are often misunderstood or oversimplified. Here's a quick taste of the episode. Give it a listen.
Now, indeed, in the years that I've been working in counterterrorism, and especially on the issue of the so-called foreign terrorist fighters, you see indeed that the public perception is very much either they are all seen as victims, as young jihadi brides who've been lured by ISIS and they're totally innocent, or they're seen as the other way around, that they're seen as monsters and as calculated terrorists. And I think this is exactly what we have to be careful about. Either we are underestimating the women or we are overestimating the women. And from the research that we have conducted, although it was not focused on the profiles, but by analyzing these court cases and by conducting these interviews, we've seen actually it's much more nuanced. We see women who are victim and at the same time also perpetrator. So it isn't that black and white. And these things need to be taken into consideration, like during sentencing, but also how you deal with them during detention or when you are developing and designing an individual reintegration plan. So this image that they are either or, it isn't what we have seen from the court cases. We've seen a lot of gray areas. And you can also see that some women might have left the radical ideology and then re-engage again later with it. So it isn't on and off, and it isn't black and white.
I'm Margherita Capacci. I'm one of the producers of the podcast, and I also run the Patreon page. For this Christmas special, I picked episode 102, Bonaire's Climate Litigation, which is part of the Eco-Files. This year we saw big advancements in climate change litigations, surely at the international level, and just this month we saw the International Court of Justice hearings for the most participated climate change case ever, but also in national courts around the world. In this episode, we looked at the case brought this year by 8 residents of the Caribbean island of Bonaire, together with Greenpeace, against the Netherlands. The country is accused of violating their human rights by not taking sufficient measures to protect the islands from the effects of the climate crisis. We spoke with Effie de Kroon from Greenpeace Netherlands and Kjeld Massoud Kroon, one of the plaintiffs in the case. As always, I found it so important to look at not only the legalities, but also at what is really going on the ground. Here's a snippet of the conversation.
Would you say, Kjeld, that this climate change also has an impact on cultural heritage? And can you describe how it impacts that in your experience?
I guess the two first things I think of that are not directly like materially culture, but it's more like lifestyles, is that historically people have relied a lot on fishing, a lot of fishermen that make their daily bread that way. Also farming. My grandpa himself used to be a farmer. He used to. Is the important word here. Because of the heat and just plants not growing anymore, a lot of farmers had to transition their lifestyle and work into something else. I know my grandpa now, he still has goats, for example, but the growing of corn and things that he did when I was young, it's just not possible anymore. So I think that's culturally also, it's just a big shift that people have to do and find other ways of working and things like that. Same goes with fishermen. The population, the amount of fish that they can catch is becoming worse and worse, meaning that they cannot live their daily lives anymore and get around to paying the things they need to pay. that makes life more difficult. And yes, just like Afi just mentioned, we have the slave huts, which are these tangible parts of our heritage. They tie back to the colonial days, and they're really close to the coast on the south side of the island. And that's one of the areas that's going to be affected the quickest because it's also very flat. It's the flattest part of the island. I would also say when it comes to just general, say, weekend entertainment and things like that, one of the areas that gets affected the most anytime we have a storm is the one boulevard that we have on the island where pretty much all the restaurants and cafes and things like that are. And any storm that happens, it's the first place that you see that's totally destroyed, totally wrecked, and we have to rebuild it every time again and every time again. I would say those are some of the things I can think of directly when it comes to what we're losing culturally.
I'm Susanna, and I'm one of the producers on the podcast. I chose to revisit our episode on Russian hate speech. It's that simple yet effective war tactic of dehumanizing the other, which we're currently seeing play out in Ukraine. Here, Janet and Steph speak to Ilya Nuzov and Anna Vishnyakov about the key propaganda lines Russia's government and its state-backed media are using to justify their actions. Lines that get fed to Russian soldiers to justify their actions. A popular one is that Ukraine is run by Nazis. It's a narrative intricately tied to Russia's strong patriotic history surrounding World War II. Here, Ilya explains why this theme is so popular. And I've also added an extra bit at the end where Ilya gives some examples of what Russian influencers are currently saying. Take a listen.
I think it's very important to understand the significance of the victory of the Soviet Union in the Second World War as an identity-building bloc of post-Soviet Russia. It has been used to consolidate Putin's regime's hold on power because Putin's regime has roots in the Soviet past. He is the former lieutenant of the KGB, so he comes from Soviet power structures. And there is not a lot of historic material in the Soviet past to draw on to legitimize the current political elites. And so the victory in the Second World War has been used to legitimize the political elites and to sort of rally the Russian people around the current political elites, drawing on the Soviet Union's history. And that's been used to drive both the domestic and foreign policy in Russia. And the reason why Ukraine is portrayed as a Nazi state is exactly to enable the use of the mobilizing potential of the victory in the Second World War. So by depicting Ukraine as a Nazi state, Russia is able to now say, look, we're conducting a liberation campaign in Ukraine, as we have done in the past with respect to Europe. We looked at several categories of statements. So the words that aim to denigrate, insult, humiliate Ukrainians, such as the word Nazi, chachol, which is a pejorative term for Ukrainian, often used by Russians, Ukro-Nazi, which is sort of a neologism combining the term Ukrainian and Nazi, but then scum, vermin, Satanists, blisters, the worms. I mean, the list is very, very long. So some of the things that have stuck in my mind personally are statements made by this guy called Sergei Mardan, who is a radio personality who very casually offered to burn alive Nazis. But by Nazis, we need to understand that he meant regular Ukrainians who are just not willing to cooperate and collaborate with the occupying authority. He suggested creating gulags for teachers who refuse to collaborate with the Russians in the Zaporizhia region.
My name is Valentina, and I'm an intern of editing at Asymmetrical Haircuts. The episode that I choose as my favorite is episode 82 on Venezuela with Marta Baliñas and Joana Frivet. It's a bit obvious that I will choose this episode because I'm from Venezuela, but overall I really enjoyed it. I have a lot of affection for this episode because it's the first Asymmetrical Haircuts episode that I ever listened to, and that essentially got me so excited to work with and for the podcast, as well as Janet and Stephanie, of course. I also think that the episode does a really great job at including an intersectional analysis of the crisis in Venezuela, specifically regarding human rights violations. I think it's a wonderful overview of the judicial flaws of the country, as well as some geopolitical international dynamics with Venezuela. There's inclusion of the crime situation with indigenous communities, as well as recognition of strength of civil society. So overall, I just really enjoyed this podcast. And here is a small extract from the episode. Take a listen.
The first thing that is very specific to the situation in Venezuela is how the judiciary is very involved in the commission of crimes against humanity. And this is something that we always have difficulties to convey and explain when you outline the scope and the types of crimes that we're dealing with. Because it's not just arbitrary detentions. It's very often people who've been arbitrarily detained and then who've gone before a judge who has seemingly legitimized further a detention against an alleged dissident, right? On charges that range anything from treason to theft, made up charges very often. And this is a pattern that has been seen to be widespread and systematic. So what we see from this is that there's a real lack of separation of powers. The authority in Venezuela, very much the state authorities control the judiciary. And that is very specific to Venezuela. And they do that by controlling the judges of the Supreme Court. And one of the things that we've noted in the last report of the OAS, in which we analyzed in detail the institutional reforms that the government has engaged in over the last 2 years, we've seen that this has actually worsened instead of improving. So the state of Venezuela is advertising itself as being a reforming state, a state in process of reforming legislations that were previously not up to standards. What we've seen is that actually enacted legislations to entrench the lack of accountability against high-level officials.
This is Lindis. I'm a social media intern at Asymmetrical Haircuts, and I also study international justice in The Hague. I chose the Counting Casualties episode as my favorite because I think that we're all extremely used to seeing numbers of casualties and deaths from armed conflicts in the headlines these days, and it's very easy to just take that at face value and not think about all the effort that has to go into getting that number, making sure that number is accurate, and that the people, the human beings that are represented in that number are properly taken care of and acknowledged, no matter who they are.
Emily, in that webinar that I was listening to, you used a phrase, ranges of ambiguity. Just before we started recording this, I was listening to a podcast about what's been going on in Ethiopia, Tigray. And my God, there was a range of ambiguity there about how many people might have died. And there was a very strong line to say, we actually care less about places which are further away from us and where essentially it's brown people who are being killed. The amount we know is basically dependent on how close people are to us in feel and ethnicity, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we try and do is pick up on all of the things that are said already by local voices on the ground. If you look in Gaza, one of the main sources for us are relatives who are posting about, people who are posting about their relatives who've been killed, and they're just putting their whole family names and they're putting everything. And only in a few times do you see those posts picked up by the international media. I mean, it's due to a whole number of things, and usually institutional racism is at the bottom of it. But you see a kind of general distrust of local reporting. The real tragedy is that it's not that these things aren't being said. I think we can say for sure in certain remote locations it's really challenging to get information, but in other locations it's really not that challenging. Talk about Gaza, talk about Syria. I mean, these are cases where, and we can kind of see a direct correlation. It's an awful kind of tragic thing, but we can see a direct correlation between the more conflict is ignored, the more graphic the imagery becomes, because the civilians on the ground just think, well, you just haven't seen the right picture. Surely you just haven't seen this picture of this child. You don't know this thing, because if you did, you would do something about it. And that's all of our shame that we're not doing anything about it.
It was so nice to hear the little snippets of episodes we did all through the year, and I'm always amazed at how much we actually put out. We'll be back with you in the new year with more to come. Have a lovely new year. Goodbye.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg. This episode was created in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice efforts for mass violence, and with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.